What is up, gamers? Whoa, quiet down. One at a time, please. This is the fifth part of a larger essay regarding the design of enemy attacks in action games. The first two parts introduce the idea of enemy attack cadence and define some concepts that should help the audience to understand an analysis of it. The short story is that enemy attack cadence defines how, when, and from where enemy attacks activate. The third and fourth parts of the essay talked about the first two important pillars of this, timing and proximity. Now, the third pillar to discuss is concurrency, which refers to how many attackers can attack a target at the same time. Concurrency is determined before each attack actually takes place. It's not part of any single enemy attack. As games and game technology evolved, more opportunities arose for games to spawn more enemies performing more complex behaviors, and this is when enemy attack concurrency began to become vitally important to combat design. The term attack tickets, defined in the second part of this essay, helps to understand how games design their combat around this pillar, and whether or not a game even has an attack ticket system is vital to clarifying its identity within its subgenre. When scaling from the smallest to the highest number of enemies attacking the player at once, obviously 0 is invalid, so we'll start with 1. Since this essay ruled out fighting games from the discussion, there are actually not many well-known games where the player literally fights only one enemy at a time, and even the few that exist often break that rule. In these games, usually the enemy attack cadence is distilled down to timing and proximity, with concurrency being irrelevant and direction becoming largely irrelevant as a result. The combat design is either a literal duel or some kind of interesting combat-like challenge between the player and the entity that they're dealing with. Games focused exclusively on dueling are generally PvP games, and this probably says something about what most people find fun to play and create when it comes to enemy designs and player toolkits in PvE games. Once developers make combat about dueling, the player expects a single enemy to be very engaging in its own right for more than just a few seconds, which implies that the enemy has to be a mini-boss or boss in terms of development and behavior complexity. Even in games that offer this approach generally speaking, they often break the rule of only having one enemy at some point in their runtime. There are a couple games that basically fall into the previous category most of the time, but it is still possible for multiple enemies to attack the player at the same time. In these games, the focus is on 1v1 duels, but other enemies in the arena can interrupt duels depending on the player's proximity to them. Developers create cadence systems in these games to give priority to the closest proximity attacker, and the player can use this to their advantage to position themselves and manage a single enemy at a time, lowering the likelihood that a second or third enemy will be able to gain the ground to interrupt the player's current duel. The next two approaches are a bit confusing to assign terms to, as there isn't really language that distills the difference between them codified in game development. The first obtusely named category is free attacker games. In these games, there are few to no higher level systems orchestrating the rate at which multiple enemies may attack the player. The attacks are free because no system assigns them a cost to limit them. Every enemy has its own individual rules for when and why they would attack the player, usually boiling down to proximity and cooldowns between attacks. If there is a horde of enemies around the player, all of them will make decisions as to whether to attack independently from one another. These games manage concurrency usually through encounter and level design. Either designers place the enemies in such a way that triggering too many active attacks against the player is basically impossible, or developers design the game such that the player can easily manipulate the enemy positions in order to wrangle a manageable attack concurrency themselves. Next, attack ticketed games are those in which there is some form of attack ticketing and/or other concurrency management systems in play. Remember that for more information on how attack ticket systems work, refer back to the second part of the essay. These games gate the total number of attacks that may be active against the player, whether by making all attacks in the game require one ticket, or by making different attacks have different ticket values by attack type or by situation, such as a strong attack costing more tickets than a weak one. These systems allow combat designers to author the player combat experience into something manageable, and they're often used in games with encounters that have between 6 or more active enemies. Every enemy is meant to be a valid threat at all times, but if every enemy actively attacked simultaneously, the player would become quickly frustrated or overwhelmed. This is usually because individual enemy attacks are varied, complicated, and most importantly dangerous, and maybe even able to interrupt the player. In descending the pillars of enemy attack cadence in order of importance, this essay also ascends them in order of how difficult it is to know exactly what a game is doing to manage them. A designer can learn about attack tickets working in the game industry, but developers don't even use the same terminology within the industry to account for what is now a widely employed concept. Even knowing how attack tickets work, it's impossible to know how a specific game actually uses them without the developers explaining them outside of the game. Some games make it easier to notice the obvious ticketing that's happening. Some games make it clear through difficulty options that more frequent attacks will come from enemies when the difficulty is scaled up, but some games that probably use ticket systems might not seem to be doing so because the player gets attacked very often regardless. The last approach is games where the player is fighting hordes of enemies. In these games, there is likely also a ticketing system, along with other cadence systems to control the number and frequency of incoming attacks. The difference is that Horde attacker games do not intend for the player to parse individual enemy attacks often, as the assumption is that there will be a large number of concurrent attackers at any given high-stress moment. What? A popular topic in AI development that some gamers have heard of is the AI director used for the encounter design of Left 4 Dead 2. Valve created this system to dynamically handle the pacing of missions in a way that makes every replay of a level feel fresh. Based on explanations of it, it appears that the AI director includes concurrency and timing systems that manage which enemies can attack each player based on a level of stress that the player is currently experiencing. Even in games where the combat intention is for a group of players to become overwhelmed by literal armies of enemies, the most refined games of this type have systems that make that experience easy to understand. Another tool these games use is making basic enemies incredibly simplistic and predictable, only raising the complexity and challenge with regards to special enemies that have clear callouts and ease of discovery amongst the larger mobs and take precedence as an active threat. However, a Horde game might forego a conventional ticketing system if the intent is for the player to be overwhelmed at all times. For instance, a co-op game might focus its concurrency systems more on spreading its relentless attackers between players. Or, something like a Bullet Heaven can wrap back around to becoming a free attacker game with the enemy spawn numbers increased to the maximum possible level. The number of enemies that can attack the player at once creates specific expectations for how the player approaches individual enemies and groups of enemies, which in turn impacts how the player moves through the level. Of course, the number of enemies per square meter of combat arena also has a pretty large impact on how developers design levels, and encounter size is correlated with attack concurrency. After all, if the game spawned 40 enemies and only 3 of them could attack at a time, it would probably look pretty strange. Therefore, developers have to drive a stake in the sand relatively early in development regarding how many enemies are even going to be in a single arena, and if there are reinforcements, where those reinforcements will come from. These decisions have impacts on the combat arena design and how that can support combat encounters. This essay proposes that of all 4 pillars, concurrency is the most complex and varied in its own right. The systems that manage it change enormously across subgenres of action games, and a player can find different concurrency systems at play, even within similar products. Whether or not a game uses any concurrency management systems at all, not only massively influences the feel of the game, but it also changes the balance of the game, literally gating and controlling the overall damage per second that enemy characters can deal. Concurrency management happens in a layer of AI where the tools are completely different across development teams, and the nuances of specific tools can change what elements of the gameplay the designers can tune and how much control they have over the final experience. For instance, a concurrency system could be so complex that it has both attack tickets as well as a priority-driven attacker assignment system, where the latter system determines which specific ranged and melee enemies can attack the player based on distance, camera angle, the damage between the enemy and the player, the amount of time an enemy has been in a hit reaction, and more. Then, with all the enemies who are allowed to attack based on those rules, they will still have to turn in attack tickets and they won't be able to attack all at once. These systems make it possible for designers to control which enemies are the active aggressors and which are sitting in the background. On the opposite end of the spectrum, the less the designers control the concurrency cadence of combat, the more immediate combat can feel. In such games, when executed well, the player can have a much clearer intuitive sense of the rules under which the enemies are going to attack, and there is likely fundamentally less chaos in the arena in terms of multiple attackers juggling their attempts to attack, which can all make everything cleaner to parse. The best examples of this are in FromSoft's Souls games, where at times a game might throw a dozen enemies at the player at once, but players rarely call these encounters out as the most difficult to manage or understand, reserving those concerns for boss fights, because it's so easy to control the positioning and attack rate of the enemies based off of where the player moves. The last interesting point here regards dueling versus group combat. When games simplify concurrency down to 1v1 dueling, this becomes a great lens through which to distill the fundamental combat loop to its most essential form. However, 1v1 combat is always a very different game feel. Boss encounters aim to highlight a contrast between fighting one immensely strong enemy versus many weaker enemies. For games that feature both, the ability to balance these two ends of the spectrum may be one of the largest signals of mastery, revealing whether the developers tightly and cohesively designed the player and enemy toolkits, or whether they lost or forgot something in the equation of the overall combat design. So that was concurrency, a less often discussed feature of enemy attacks, yet one that players feel the pressure of constantly. With that, the essay is approaching the denouement with the last pillar of direction.
You want me to go over there?
What? No.
Where are you pointing? The camera?
Don't talk about the camera.
But I thought that's what the next part is about.